We would like to send out a special thanks to the fun and challenging Best Fiends for supporting The Trail Went Cold. Best Fiends is the binge-worthy mobile puzzle game. Download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Enjoy the show. February 1st, 1999. DeSoto County, Mississippi. While living in a farmhouse with her 2 children and her boyfriend, 27-year-old Katherine Lowery vanishes without explanation. Months later, Katherine's boyfriend takes the children and abruptly moves to Wyoming, but he winds up being arrested when Katherine's daughter accuses him of sexual abuse. It turns out the boyfriend has been living under an alias, and his real name is Steven DeLoge, and investigators learn that his 23-year-old half-sister, Elizabeth Eisel, vanished under suspicious circumstances in Washington state in 1985. Even though Steven goes to prison on multiple counts of sexual assault, he fails to provide any answers about what actually happened to Elizabeth and Katherine. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and on today's episode, we're going to be presenting what is probably one of the most bizarre stories we've ever covered, and it involves 2 missing women: the 1985 disappearance of Elizabeth Eisel and the 1999 disappearance of Katherine Lowery. While these disappearances took place years apart in different states, they were both unusual in that the victims were not actually reported missing until a great deal of time after they were last seen, and they were linked together by a man named Steven DeLoge. I'll be sharing more details momentarily, but let's just say that Elizabeth Eisel's case almost feels like a lost love segment from Unsolved Mysteries gone horribly wrong. After being put up for adoption following her birth, Elizabeth decided to track down her biological family and reunited with her half-brother, Steven DeLoge, but the story would prove to be anything but heartwarming, and Elizabeth would eventually vanish without a trace. Many years later, Steven was living under a false name when he got involved in a relationship with a single mother named Katherine Lowery, but shortly after they moved in together, Katherine would also go missing, and Steven remained the guardian for her 2 children for the next several months. At the time of this recording, Steven DeLoge is serving multiple terms in prison for sexually abusing Katherine's daughter, and while he remains the prime suspect in the disappearances of both these women, their bodies have never been found, and the authorities lack the evidence to file murder charges against them. If this story was a work of fiction, you'd probably criticize many of the twists and turns which take place as being way too over the top to be believable, but these events actually happened, and there are still 2 missing women out there who deserve coverage on this episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now delve into the disappearances of Elizabeth Eisel and Katherine Lowery. Our story begins in DeSoto County, Mississippi in 1999. Our first victim is 27-year-old Katherine Lowery, who originally hails from the city of Meridian. Katherine is a single mother raising a 9-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter, and for reasons that will soon become obvious, their names have never been released publicly. As far as I can tell, the children's father was no longer in their lives, and at this particular point, the family is living in a farmhouse on a 25-acre property on Center Hill Road, located outside the town of Olive Branch, just south of the Tennessee state line. The house was originally rented by Katherine's boyfriend, Sheldon Wright Van Hout, whom she began dating in 1998. After living together for a while, the couple temporarily separated before Katherine and her children moved into a motel in Memphis, but she wound up getting back together with Sheldon by the end of the year. At the time, Sheldon was employed at a heating and air conditioning firm owned by the husband of Mary Stewart, a property manager who rented out the farmhouse to Sheldon. By the time January rolled around, Katherine agreed to move in with Sheldon, but approximately 1 month later, she would seemingly vanish without a trace. Now, the actual circumstances of how Katherine disappeared are unclear, but from February until August, there would be no independent eyewitness sightings of her, though Mary Stewart would later claim that there were at least 2 occasions where Sheldon visited her at her office and brought Katherine's 2 children along with him. Sheldon told Stewart that he and Katherine were planning to homeschool the kids, but Stewart informed him that he still needed to register them with the county school authorities. The last time Stewart saw Sheldon was on August the 23rd, when he asked to borrow some money to take Katherine to her mother's house in Meridian. After this, Sheldon stopped showing up for work, and shortly thereafter, the farmhouse was discovered to be abandoned and completely emptied out. Since the front door was left open, it appeared that Sheldon, Katherine, and the children had left very abruptly, but since there was no evidence that a crime took place, no missing persons report was ever filed. However, the case would take a disturbing turn on November the 3rd of that year, when the Laramie County Sheriff's Office in Cheyenne, Wyoming, was contacted by a local resident about a young girl who needed help. The girl turned out to be Katherine Lowery's daughter, who told police that she had not seen her mother for 9 months, and that both she and her brother had essentially been held captive by Sheldon Van Hout. Now, there is some conflicting information out there about the last date Katherine was seen alive, as many of the missing persons websites list February the 2nd, 1999, but most of the media coverage says it was February the 1st. Either way, the date when Katherine's daughter said she last saw her mother also happened to coincide with her 8th birthday, which is why she distinctly remembered it. According to the girl, Sheldon would tell her and her brother that their mother had run away, and he spent the next several months raising them on his own. On August the 24th, Sheldon made the sudden decision to move out of their farmhouse in DeSoto County and drive the 2 children over 1,100 miles to Cheyenne. Over the next 11 weeks, they would live in 2 separate motels where the girl was sexually abused by Sheldon. She claimed that the abuse had been going on for over a year, but while they were living in Cheyenne, Sheldon raped her virtually every night, often while her brother was asleep in a different room. Sheldon never attempted to enroll either of the kids in school, and after he got another job as a heating and air conditioning specialist, he ordered the 2 children to never leave the motel during the day while he was at work. He managed to instill a tremendous amount of fear into them, but on November the 3rd, while the 2 kids were left alone unsupervised, the girl finally decided to make an escape and went to a neighbor's house, where she asked them to call the police. After the girl was given a physical exam which showed strong evidence of sexual abuse, Sheldon was arrested and charged with 11 counts of second-degree sexual assault. He was held in the Laramie County Jail, and a federal grand jury in Oxford, Mississippi, would later indict Sheldon on 1 count of crossing state lines with the intent of sexually assaulting a juvenile under the age of 12. The 2 kids would be placed in foster care, and when Sheldon was arraigned in district court and asked how he wanted to plead to the charges, he replied, quote, "Not frickin' guilty," before making an obscene gesture at the district attorney. When the Laramie County Sheriff's Office notified the DeSoto County Sheriff's Department about what was going on, they proceeded to file a missing persons report for Katherine Lowery and perform a search of the farmhouse where she had lived. The residence had been completely emptied out and given a thorough cleaning, but when chemical sprays were used, they detected traces of blood on the floors and the walls, giving credence to the idea that Katherine had become a victim of foul play. There was speculation that Katherine may have been buried somewhere on the 25-acre property, but a search of the property using infrared technology turned up nothing. Curiously, a search of Sheldon's possessions following his arrest would turn up some old paperwork from the police department in Bellevue, Washington, which would take the case in a very unexpected direction. It turned out that Sheldon Wright Van Hout was an alias, and his real name was Steven Allen DeLoge. At the time of his arrest, Steven/Sheldon was 40 years old, and he was believed to have used at least 11 different aliases throughout the course of his life. He also had a lengthy criminal record, as he had been arrested for numerous crimes such as burglary, armed robbery, cocaine possession, and arson. However, the most shocking revelation was that Steven was a person of interest in the disappearance of his 23-year-old wife Danielle DeLoge, who vanished without explanation from Bellevue, Washington in September of 1985. But what made the situation truly bizarre is that Danielle DeLoge was not actually Steven's wife, as her real name was Elizabeth Eisel, and she was Steven's half-sister. Okay, I'm sure you're horribly confused right now, so now I'm going to reveal why I made that analogy, referring to this story as a lost love segment from Unsolved Mysteries Gone Horribly Wrong. After she was born in 1962, Elizabeth was put up for adoption, but when she was 19 years old, Elizabeth lost her adoptive mother in a car accident. This event compelled Elizabeth to seek out her biological family, and while it's unclear if she ever found her birth parents, she discovered that she had a half-brother named Steven DeLoge. After moving to Orange County, California, Elizabeth had a reunion with Steven, who already had a prior criminal record and was technically wanted on arson charges at this point. And this is where things get really weird. I'm not entirely sure how much Elizabeth knew about Steven's criminal history, but he eventually convinced her to change her name to Danielle DeLoge so they can pass themselves off as husband and wife. And while they never officially got married, Steven and Elizabeth/Daniel began a relationship for real, which led to Elizabeth becoming pregnant and giving birth to a son in 1983. 2 years later, they decided to take their child and relocate from California to Bellevue, Washington, where they moved into an apartment complex. However, several months after they arrived, the relationship had pretty much fallen apart, and Elizabeth had gotten herself involved with another man. Steven also developed an interest in another woman at their apartment complex, but she told Steven she would not date him until he ended his relationship with Elizabeth. In August, Steven and Elizabeth got into a violent argument, which prompted her to take their son and move into her boyfriend's residence. She told her boyfriend that she was finally going to break things off with Steven for good after the Labor Day holiday weekend. On September the 3rd, Elizabeth took her son and left her boyfriend's residence, presumably to go back to the apartment complex to see Steven, but she never returned, and this was the last time she was confirmed to be alive. The details of how the original police investigation were handled are pretty murky, but the Bellevue PD did presumably speak to Steven at some point and confirmed that his 2-year-old son was back living with him again. It sounds like Steven told the authorities that Elizabeth had abandoned their child and taken off on her own, leaving behind all of her personal possessions, and I'm guessing that they took him at his word, since no missing persons report was filed at that time. Almost immediately after Elizabeth disappeared, Steven began a relationship with the other woman from the apartment complex, and by December of that year, they had gotten married and left the state together. However, Steven elected to abandon his son by leaving him behind with a babysitter, and the boy would be placed in the custody of Washington State Child Protective Services. By this point, Elizabeth had become estranged from her adoptive family, so her absence was not noticed for years. In August of 1988, Elizabeth's adoptive father, Leroy Eisel, decided to contact the Bellevue Police Department since he had been searching for her and heard that Bellevue was the last place she had been living. After learning the circumstances of Elizabeth's disappearance, Leroy officially filed a missing persons report for her nearly 3 full years after she was last seen. While the Bellevue PD would make attempts to track down Steven, they would have trouble locating him until they were informed that he was arrested in Wyoming in 1999. It turned out that after leaving Bellevue, Steven and his new wife had relocated to Idaho and had a few children of their own. But after a number of domestic problems, they divorced sometime in the mid-1990s, and Steven left the state and changed his name to Sheldon Wright Van Hout before he eventually crossed paths with Katherine Lowery. After they learned about Steven's arrest for sexually assaulting Katherine's daughter, a detective from the Bellevue PD went to interview his ex-wife, but she was reportedly reluctant to speak about her time with Steven because she was still fearful of him. Even though authorities believed that Steven was responsible for the disappearances of Elizabeth Eisel and Katherine Lowery, their bodies could not be found, and they lacked the necessary evidence to file additional charges against him. However, Steven was still facing serious prison time for the sexual abuse of Katherine's daughter, and in May of 2000, right before he was scheduled to go on trial, he made a failed suicide attempt in jail by cutting his arms, but the wounds were not serious enough to be fatal. The trial ultimately never took place, as Steven agreed to a plea deal after he learned that the state was planning to introduce DNA evidence which showed that there was a 1 in 62 trillion chance that anyone else other than Steven could have been the perpetrator of these crimes. He wound up pleading guilty to 6 counts of second-degree sexual assault, and a sentencing hearing took place in district court in December of 2000. Katherine's daughter was brought in to make a statement in which she expressed her desire for Steven to be put in prison for the rest of his life. Katherine's son was also allowed to speak in front of the court, and when he asked, "Where's my mom?" Steven did not answer. The judge decided to impose a sentence of 6 life terms for each of the sexual assault counts, which would be served consecutively at the Wyoming State Penitentiary. In September of 2007, a skull was found in a wooded area of DeSoto County, just a few miles away from the farmhouse where Steven and Katherine had been living, but when DNA from the skull was compared to DNA from Katherine's 2 children, it turned out not to be a match. Steven continues to remain incarcerated today, though he has attempted to appeal his conviction numerous times. In fact, Steven has filed so many frivolous appeals which are completely devoid of merit that the Wyoming Supreme Court has issued an order which bars him from filing any more appeals in state court without first obtaining leave from the Chief Justice of the Wyoming Supreme Court. Of course, that hasn't stopped Steven from continuing to file appeals, but the Chief Justice has repeatedly denied his requests. Steven has also never admitted to having any role in the disappearances of Elizabeth or Katherine, so they both continue to remain missing persons. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. But before we continue, we would like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Best Fiends. Best Fiends is a mobile puzzle game that anyone can download and play, and whether you just have a few minutes or a few hours, you can really lose yourself in this game because it's so much fun. Writing, researching, and hosting a podcast are tasks that can take up a considerable amount of time, but when I find myself with a few minutes to spare, one of the best ways to unplug and lose yourself is Best Fiends. After all, there are moments when you need to take a break from true crime, so Best Fiends is a great way to unwind, and even though I consider myself to be a highly organized person, it's actually quite satisfying to lose track of time for a while when I'm on a winning streak on this game and don't want to lose momentum. I enjoy the rush of adrenaline I receive when I beat a level, and thankfully, this has happened to me quite a bit, since I've been playing Best Fiends for over 2 years, and have recently passed level 3200. Indeed, since there are thousands of levels and new characters and puzzles are added all the time, you can literally play as long as you want and never get bored. Trust me on that. So download Best Fiends free today on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of this episode. So obviously, this is one of those episodes where there really doesn't seem to be much of a mystery per se about what actually happened, but the circumstances of this story are so bizarre that I felt I had to cover it, especially since we still have 2 missing women out there who have never been found. I first learned about both these cases over 8 years ago when I was putting together an article I published for listverse.com titled 10 People Who Are Not Reported Missing for Years. I've always been disturbed by cases in which a victim disappears, but it's a long period of time before anyone notices and files a missing persons report to launch an official investigation. Another case I featured in that ListFirst article wound up being the subject of an episode on the Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries about a young woman named Lena Chapin who vanished in February of 2006 but was not actually reported missing until November of 2008, and it would be another couple years before the authorities even started investigating her disappearance. It's always been suspected that Lena was murdered by her own mother, who pretty much just moved on with her life after disposing of Lena's body and hoped that people wouldn't ask questions about where she was. And it sounds like the same thing pretty much happened to Elizabeth Eisel and Katherine Lowery, who were both involved with a man who didn't seem particularly concerned about the fact they were missing. In both these cases, we do have specific dates in which an independent eyewitness recalled last seeing the victim alive, but because it would be a long time before law enforcement became involved, it was a lot more difficult to backtrack and figure out how, where, and when they might have been murdered, and discover the location of their bodies. What's sad about this story is that even though we know quite a bit about the alleged perpetrator, Steven DeLoge, we really don't know much about the two victims or what their lives were like before they met him. We know that Elizabeth Eisel was put up for adoption following her birth and felt compelled to track down her biological relatives after the death of her adoptive mother, but we really don't know anything about her upbringing with her adoptive family. The sources state that she was estranged from her relatives at the time she disappeared, but her adoptive father did try to find her and was the one who officially reported her missing in 1988. And while we know that Katherine Lowery was a single mother raising 2 children prior to her disappearance, we know very little else about her, and it's unclear if the children's biological father still played any sort of role in their lives at this point. Curiously, Katherine's profile page at many of the missing persons websites state that she might use the name Connie Harper, but there's no additional context provided for this. I do have some additional background information on Steven DeLoge, though none of it really details his own upbringing. I know that Steven and Elizabeth were half-siblings, but we know nothing about their birth parents, and I have no idea if Elizabeth was able to track them down when she had a reunion with Steven. The earliest information I could dig up about Steven were some newspaper articles from Honolulu, Hawaii in September of 1980, which reported that he had been arrested in Honolulu when he attempted to steal a purse from a 51-year-old woman at a bus stop until other witnesses chased him down and held him until the police arrived. After Steven was taken into custody, the woman elected not to press charges, but when police performed a computer check, they discovered that Steven was wanted in Eugene, Oregon on charges of arson and burglary. After Steven was extradited there, it sounds like he served a few years in the Oregon State Penitentiary before he met Elizabeth in California, but I think he had other outstanding charges against him at that time, which is why he convinced Elizabeth to change her name and pass herself off as his wife. When Steven got married to another woman following Elizabeth's disappearance, they moved to Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and had children together, but Steven would make the news again for an incident which took place in 1993. On January the 4th of that year, Steven's wife got into a minor fender bender in a bank parking lot with a man named Federico Cortez, who reportedly cursed at her over the incident in front of her children. After hearing about what happened, Steven went to confront Cortez at his residence, and the whole thing escalated into a fight that ended with Cortez allegedly biting off a corner of Steven's left ear. The matter would be taken to district court, and even though the magistrate believed that Steven was the one who started the fight, he believed that Cortez had crossed the line by biting his ear off and charged him with aggravated battery. When Cortez went on trial for the charge, the jury was unable to reach a verdict, as some of the jurors felt that Steven's ear might have been ripped off accidentally during the chaos, rather than bitten off intentionally. I'm not sure if they ever took the case to trial again, but I do know that Steven filed a civil complaint against Cortez for damages in December of 1994. When Cortez's attorney served Steven with a request to provide them with documentation and other evidence in a timely fashion, these items were not received until 6 months after the proposed deadline, so Cortez eventually filed a motion for a summary judgment, which was granted by the district court. So yes, this ear-biting incident was a relatively minor event in a story which involves 2 missing women, but it just seems to demonstrate that chaos follows around Steven DeLoge everywhere he goes. It's pretty crazy that the Wyoming Supreme Court has essentially banned Steven from filing any more frivolous appeals for the multiple life sentences he received for sexually assaulting Katherine's daughter, because really, what is there to appeal about? He flat out pled guilty to these charges, and there was conclusive DNA evidence that he did it, so the type of arguments he has made in his appeals are that the judge should not have sentenced him to 6 life sentences for the same crime, because that violated double jeopardy statutes. Well, that's not how double jeopardy works at all, because he was charged with multiple counts of sexual assault for abusing his victim on multiple occasions, so he wasn't sentenced for just one crime. That ruling prompted Steven to file a civil rights lawsuit against the Wyoming Supreme Court last year, but not surprisingly, it wound up getting dismissed. And as if he wasn't causing enough trouble from behind bars, at one point, Steven attempted to file a workers' compensation claim after he was injured while working in the prison kitchen, as he got into a heated confrontation with another inmate who headbutted him and broke his nose. The Wyoming Supreme Court ultimately ruled that prisoners who are injured on the job as a result of an altercation with other prisoners are not eligible for workers' compensation benefits. So it goes without saying that Steven DeLoge is a terrible human being, but let's look at each of these featured cases individually. Once again, Elizabeth Eisel's story almost seems like a lost love segment from Unsolved Mysteries gone horribly wrong, because just imagine watching one of those heartwarming reunions between long-lost siblings, and then finding out years after the fact that one of them likely killed the other. And not only that, but they wound up becoming involved in a relationship and having a child together, even though they were technically related. Well, believe it or not, there's actually a term for this called genetic sexual attraction, as there are documented cases where people have met long-lost blood relatives for the first time during adulthood, and then claim they developed a strong sexual attraction towards them. Of course, some experts have dismissed genetic sexual attraction as pseudoscience and believe it is nothing more than an attempt to sound scientific while minimizing the taboo of incest. I wish there were more details available about how the relationship between Steven and Elizabeth developed after they first met, as it sounds like Steven convinced Elizabeth to change her name to Danielle to pass herself off as his wife, as a convenient way to hide from some of his legal troubles, but then their relationship became a reality. But it would not surprise me at all if Steven was very controlling towards his half-sister and manipulated her into the situation. I know that Elizabeth was not officially reported missing until 1988, 3 years after she was last seen, but given that she had a new boyfriend and happened to vanish right when she was going to confront Steven and end the relationship, I really don't understand why the Bellevue Police Department did not take her disappearance more seriously at the time, as I'm sure the boyfriend would have informed them about what was going on. It sounds like the police failed to perform due diligence and took Steven at his word that Elizabeth just took off on her own, but unfortunately, this was just how many missing persons cases involving adults were handled back in the 1980s. If there was no direct evidence that foul play had taken place, the victim would often get written off as a runaway, and this is why Elizabeth's disappearance got zero media coverage at all until Steven started getting investigated for Katherine's disappearance 14 years later. Another reason to greatly dislike Steven is the fact that he abandoned his 2-year-old son only a few months after Elizabeth vanished, when he married another woman from his apartment complex and moved out of the state. I really have no idea what happened to their son after he was placed in Child Protective Services, but like all the other victimized children in the story, I really hope he's gone on to live a happy life and is doing okay today. Since this other woman told Steven that she would not start dating him until he ended his relationship with Elizabeth, that presented a likely motive for him to make her disappear, but what's incredibly frustrating is how senseless his actions were. The last time Elizabeth was seen alive, she was on her way to break up with Steven, which is exactly what he seemed to want anyway, so why kill her? I guess future child custody issues could have been a potential motive, but since Steven abandoned his son when he left the state a few months later, he obviously had no interest in raising him and could have easily left the boy in his mother's care. If Elizabeth's disappearance could have been a premeditated murder or a crime of passion where Steven lost control and killed Elizabeth in a fit of rage before disposing of her body. While details about Steven's subsequent marriage are murky, we know that his wife was reluctant to speak to the authorities when they attempted to question her about him many years later. Even though Steven was in jail at this point, it sounds like she was still fearful of him, which would indicate that the marriage was not a happy one, and you have to wonder what she may or may not have known about Elizabeth's disappearance and if she suspected him of being a murderer during their time together. And while Steven had more children with this woman, I get the impression that he didn't have much interest in being a part of their lives after the divorce took place, as he relocated to Mississippi, changed his name, and started a relationship with Katherine. And as a side note, Sheldon Wright Van Hout has to be one of the more obviously fake-sounding names I've ever heard. Now, what's interesting about the situation with Katherine is that it seems to be a complete reversal of Steven's previous relationships with women. He had children with both Elizabeth and his previous wife, and then just decided to abandon them when the relationships ended, yet here, Steven decided to keep on raising 2 children which weren't even his own for several months after Katherine was out of the picture. We don't really have much of an idea of what Steven and Katherine's relationship was like, only that they broke up and got together again in 1998, but at that point, she was living with her children at a motel, and since Steven was renting a farmhouse, I'm sure that moving in with him seemed like an ideal situation for them. The only person I've seen speak about their interactions with Steven during his time in Mississippi is Mary Stewart, who was the wife of Steven's employer and managed the property where he was living. She claimed that she only saw Katherine on one occasion, and that's the day they moved into the farmhouse in January of 1999. Katherine's kids have claimed that the last date they remembered seeing her before she disappeared was February the 1st, and investigators believe the recollection was accurate because it happened to be the daughter's birthday, which is a very distinct date she would remember. Considering that this was only a few weeks after they first moved into the farmhouse, it seems like things must have gone really bad really fast. Stewart did see Katherine's 2 children on a couple of occasions during the summer when he brought them by her office and claimed she didn't notice anything unusual was going on, but it sounds like the big turning point was when Stewart told Steven that he needed to register the 2 kids for homeschooling. They pretty much took off almost immediately after that, as I'm sure Steven realized that sooner or later, someone would be coming around asking questions and wondering where their mother was. Given Steven's propensity for abandoning children, you might be wondering why he would have been compelled to take Katherine's kids with him when he fled to Wyoming, rather than just make a clean break and possibly start a new life under a new alias. Well, sadly, I think he did this because he wanted to keep sexually abusing the girl, and he decided to keep her brother around as leverage in order to control her. While Steven was only charged with the sexual assault which took place in Wyoming between late August and early November, the girl did claim that the abuse had been going on for over a year. So this could provide a potential motive for Katherine's disappearance, because if she found out that Steven was sexually abusing her daughter, she may have attempted to confront him and wound up being murdered. Whatever happened to Katherine, it sounds like the 2 kids did not actually witness it, as they could only provide the last date they remembered seeing her, and claim that Steven told them their mother ran away. So I doubt they could provide any information about what Steven might have done to her body. Even though they were living on a 25-acre property at that time, which was extensively searched by the authorities, it sounds like they were unable to find any conclusive evidence that Katherine was buried there. I did read one article about this case, which stated that Steven once told investigators he had a dream about strapping a woman to a tree and killing her, so I've always wondered if this statement was based on reality, and if he might have done something like this to Katherine or Elizabeth. I know that Katherine's son and daughter have never spoken publicly about the situation in order to maintain their privacy, which is totally understandable, but I can only imagine the amount of trauma they must have experienced living with Steven as their sole guardian for 9 months. I have no idea what they're up to today, but at Steven's sentencing hearing in December of 2000, it was mentioned that they were doing pretty well in foster care. They would both be in their early 30s now, so I hope that they manage to go on and live relatively happy and stable lives. Honestly, when you combine the Elizabeth Eisel and Katherine Lowery cases together, the whole situation gives me vibes of one of the most heinous criminals of all time, Franklin Delano Floyd. In case you're not familiar with his story, in 1975, Floyd kidnapped Suzanne Savakis, the 6-year-old daughter of a woman he was dating, and raised her as his own daughter under a number of different aliases and subjected her to constant abuse. And once Suzanne reached adulthood, Floyd wound up marrying her until she was murdered in 1990. Given the twisted situation which previously occurred between Steven and his half-sister, who knows what could have ultimately happened with him and Katherine's 2 children if the girl had not escaped and went to the police. It goes without saying that being compared to Franklin Delano Floyd is not a good thing, but in all the years I've been doing this podcast, Steven DeLoge has to be one of the worst criminals I've uncovered whom no one has heard about. If you do a Google search on his name, you're not going to find any photographs of him online, and I've only ever uncovered one old picture of him in the newspaper articles. But the number of lives he's destroyed and the amount of depravity involved in his actions are pretty sickening. Hell, I would not be the least bit surprised if Steven has harmed other women throughout the course of his life and may have had some additional murders under his belt which we don't even know about. There's zero chance that Steven is ever getting out of prison on the sexual assault charges, so I'm sure the victim's loved ones are hoping that he'll just come clean one day and reveal the locations of Elizabeth and Katherine's remains. I guess the big complicating factor is that even though Steven is currently incarcerated in Wyoming, Katherine's murder likely took place in Mississippi, which has the death penalty, so unless the authorities decided to offer him a plea deal, which guaranteed he wouldn't be executed, I'm not sure he would have much incentive to talk. The fact that he keeps filing appeals against his sexual assault convictions, which are completely without merit, would seem to indicate that he will never admit that he did anything wrong. I would try to explore alternate theories which do not involve Steven DeLoge being responsible for the disappearances of Elizabeth and Katherine, but honestly, there are none. The odds against an innocent man having 2 different spouses vanish under his watch while he doesn't even attempt to report them missing have got to be astronomical. However, until the remains of these 2 victims can be recovered, and Steven is charged with their murders, these cases will continue to be unsolved mysteries. So if you happen to have any information on the disappearance of Elizabeth Eisel, please contact the Bellevue Police Department at 425-452-6917. That's 425-452-6917. And if you have any information about the disappearance of Katherine Lowery, please contact the DeSoto County Sheriff's Department at 662-469-8500. That's 662-469-8500. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now, the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I actually recorded a special bonus episode with Jules, the co-host of my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, as well as the host of her own podcast, Riddle Me That, True Crime, in which we discussed the 1983 death of Nancy Argentino. She was the girlfriend of famous professional wrestler Superfly Jimmy Snuka, and who was suspected of possibly killing her, though the case never did reach a conclusive resolution. In addition, we've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from The Path Went Chilly, in which myself, Jules, and our other co-host Ashley discussed the unsolved 1991 murder of Dick Hansen, aka the 49er Hugs murder. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listener who has signed up with us on Patreon this week, and that's Colleen O. Thank you so much for your support. I'm also pleased to announce that The Trail Went Cold has been added to the lineup for Podcast Row at 2 CrimeCon events this year. So provided that it is safe enough to travel, I'll be appearing at CrimeCon 2022, which is being held at Paris and Bally's in Las Vegas from April the 29th until May the 1st. If you would like to purchase tickets, we already have our own personalized promo code to receive a 10% discount off a standard badge. Please visit crimecon.com and enter the promo code TRAIL. I'm also hoping to appear at CrimeCon UK, being held at the Leonardo Royal Hotel and Spa in London on June the 11th and 12th. If you would like to get a 10% discount on tickets to this event, please visit crimecon.co.uk and use the promo code COLD22. In addition, I wanted to provide another reminder that I hold live streaming sessions on a platform called Get Vocal. Every Thursday night from 7 until 8 p.m. Eastern Time, I host what is essentially an after show for each week's podcast episode, where I have an interactive discussion about the featured case from said episode and answer questions and address comments from listeners. I always include a link to these sessions in our show notes, so be sure to check there for more information, or visit getvocal.com. That's GETVOKL.com. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.